Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives. Hi, and welcome back to Season 2 of Nature Solutionaries. Today we're going to talk about conservation of the Atlantic forest in Brazil, one of the most biologically diverse places on the planet. The forest stretches for 3,000 kilometers along the Brazilian coast and is made up of lush rainforests, cloud forests, as well as grasslands. Unfortunately, less than 16% of the forest remains today. While three big chunks of the forest still remain intact, most of the forests are fragmented into small pieces. Conservationists have been trying hard to connect these patches by building corridors so that wildlife can survive. One of the organizations that have been instrumental in protecting this forest is REGUA, founded by Nicholas and Micaela Locke in Guapiaçu watershed, northeast of Rio de Janeiro. Today, I'll interview their daughter, Micaela Locke, the research and communications coordinator at REGUA. We'll talk about how REGUA has created an 11,000 hectare protected area, planted thousands of trees, restored lost wetlands, and has successfully reintroduced tapirs. This episode has been created with the support of Saving Nature, a conservation organization that supports grassroots conservationists from all around the world, including REGUA. Even though I'm interested in conservation, I must admit that before conducting this interview, I haven't heard of the Atlantic forest. It seems like media only report about what's happening in the Amazon or Indonesia and the Congo Basin. Can you briefly describe what is unique about the Atlantic forest? For example, what animals live there?
Yes, of course. So it varies so much because it reaches different longitudes. So ranging from the northeast to the southeast, you get lots of different ecosystems. So inside the Atlantic forest, you have different ecosystems associated to this kind of forest. So in the northeast, you have a dry forest, and then as you come down, you start having a more humid forest. So you have mangroves inside the Atlantic forest. You could have a dry forest. You could have our type of forest, which is very wet. It's called ombrophila, and it means friends with rain. So we have a very humid type of forest. It rains a lot here in this part of the country, in Rio de Janeiro.
At least it rains somewhere.
It rains too much. So we have 9 months of the year being very humid, being very rainy, and our winter, is much drier. So as you go down, you have rainy forest, and then you reach the south of the country. It has a very unique kind of ecosystem that is composed by one species of tree that it's called an araucaria. So it's much drier. You have fields with grasses. And so I guess that's why we have such a varied type of forest, because it ranges so much. It reaches different altitudes. And of course, it's the ecosystem for different animals. Here in this part of the country, we have, as big mammals, pumas, the ocelots, the margays. We have begun a tapir reintroduction program, partnering with a university group here in Rio de Janeiro, who introduced tapirs here at REGUA, and also some monkeys in the Tijuca forest in the city of Rio. Also other big animals. We don't have, for instance, a jaguar. We used to have it, but it was hunted, and so it was last seen in the 1940s.
Oh, wow.
So we don't have this big mammal any longer because our state of Rio de Janeiro is quite populated, it's quite urban. So we don't have much forest in our state. And the forest we have, luckily, is protected. It has been protected as from the year 2000. So we have national park and state parks and municipal parks of the remaining forest.
It's very devastating to hear about the history of the Atlantic forest, all the devastation and decimation that's been done to the wildlife. How can we best protect what's left and perhaps recover some of these species that you mentioned, for example, jaguar?
I think the best solution is to turn the remaining forest into parks. And that's something that has been happening in Brazil. So we have 45,000 hectares of protected forest here in Rio de Janeiro state. It's a lot, and it belongs to a state park. So that's a very big plot of forest in Rio de Janeiro, and it's inside a very important mountain range called Serra do Mar that stretches from the north of Rio de Janeiro going to the south of São Paulo.
This is one of the three chunks that I mentioned, right?
Yes.
The big ones.
Yes, exactly. So it's very important, but everything in Rio de Janeiro is protected. So we have very good legislation, environmental legislation, which in our favor. So if you cut a tree today, you'll be easily sued or taken to the police because it's considered a crime and is very respected in our state.
Which hasn't been the case in Amazon, right?
In the Amazon, no, because the Amazon is such a big territory that is the less populated region in Brazil, because they have more than one state. You have at least 5 states belonging to the Amazon. So you don't have police enforcement. You don't have proper access to the villages, the cities. So we call it here a bit of no man's land. And even Brazilians have the impression that it's a bit dangerous to go there. You wouldn't be advised to go by yourself because there are lots of illegal mining, illegal cutting of trees. So it is a bit complicated because there's not much of we call it fiscalização. So the police is not there. It's very different from the rest of the country. So the laws don't work the same as in the other part of the country.
That's interesting. I didn't know this.
It is very interesting. And all the media talks a lot about the Amazon because, of course, it has a great role. And the rain in South America relies totally on the trees in the Amazon. We call them the flying rivers, huge voadores. One tree is able to deliver so much water into the air, and together they come down to the south of the continent, and they bring all the rain for the other parts of the continent. So that's very, very, very important. And now agriculture rely on those rains coming from the Amazon. So Brazilians are very aware of the importance of the Amazon.
It's a beautiful metaphor, and I wish that the people who are logging these forests would also realize that.
It's difficult, it's difficult.
Speaking of the work that you're doing, REGUA protects over 11,000 hectares of Atlantic forest in the Guapiaçu watershed. We just highlighted the fact that it forms the third largest remaining stand of the Atlantic forest. It's still 60% forested, which is quite unusual. So how did you create such a big protected areas?
That's a very, very nice story. It begins a long time ago with the arrival of my great-grandfather in Brazil. So you know that Brazil had lots of immigrants coming from Europe as from the 1500s, or maybe escaping the First World War. So that was the case for my family. We had some...
Was he English, Locke, or?
No, German.
Okay.
German, and he came with his two siblings, but one went to Argentina and two came to Brazil.
And when was that?
That was in 1915, so my family thinks that it maybe was before that, when we had some documents and we checked that the first document official was in 1915, so that's more or less the timing. So they were very young, and I think they wanted to have a completely new life, so they managed to get hold of this property. And on those days, it was a very, very different area because it had nothing here. It wasn't developed. There wasn't access to good roads. So if the family was coming from Rio, they had to come with a boat to the nearest town, and from there, with their horses, all the way to this farm where now REGUA is located. So they developed the farm. My ancestors had cattle, horses, mules, and it was completely different because they were cutting down some trees also because they needed to build the main infrastructure. So it was a very big thing in our region. So they opened the road, and so many people started to work at the farm, planting coffee or sugarcane. It was also something that was very popular at the time. So we had in 1930s or the 40s, we had the farm being very well known in the whole state of Rio de Janeiro. And even the president came to see this. What was this farm doing? Because it was so well known. But the third generation started to get married to people in Rio, and then that was my grandfather. He didn't want to stay here in the farm. It was very remote, very far away from Rio, from the city. So they started to sell their parts to outsiders. So the first cousin to sell his area was where he sold it to a beer company, a very big beer company in Brazil. And my grandfather wanted to sell his share, but he didn't know exactly what to do with it. He wanted to protect the area because he always loved nature, but he wasn't quite sure how to take advantage of this area. So he moved to England. And he said, well, I want to sell it, but only to someone who will protect it. And so we had a visit from someone who was friends with the family from England. So he came to this place and said, oh my gosh, you have a lovely place here with lots of forests. You cannot sell it to a developer or someone who will just turn it into maybe to a condominium. So you have to protect it. So he said, if you want, I can help. I can write a project, and I could find some possible donors. And so someone was very interested, and he said, okay, I'll buy this property, but this property will need to be immediately turned into an NGO, a conservation NGO. So my grandfather agreed on that and said, of course, we'll turn it into conservation reserve. So that happened, I think, in 1996. So, and then 2 years later, one of the other heirs sold his part where we worked, where we had the offices, the lodge, because there were 4 big plots. The first one sold to the beer company. The second, my grandfather sold it to this English donor who created the reserve. The third one sold it to the same English person. And we managed to create the offices, the lodge, transform the old houses into places where people could sleep or we could receive researchers. And lastly, the fourth property still belongs to the family. So it was a huge farm. It was a huge farm, but at the end of the day, more than half of it is now protected and has become the reserve. So Nicholas, who is my father, he was brought up. He was born in England. He was brought up there. He studied in England, but he always loved being here in Brazil. He was enchanted with the forests, with the biodiversity. And well, when he graduated from school, he said, I'll give it a try in Brazil because his uncle was living here. And he said, maybe I'll go into farming and helping him before the creation of the reserve. So he came to live in Brazil. And that's when this friends and the family came and started this idea of finding donors. So he was at the right timing, and he managed to follow all of this story. So he already knew the place, and he was the most suitable candidate to be part or to lead the reserve. So he was the one who was the friend and was named the president of the reserve in the year 2000, maybe.
Wow, that's a very impressive story.
It started very small, very small. It had around 900 hectares.
900?
Yes, because it started with the first plot of area that the grandfather sold. And then 2 years later, the area with the offices was bought. So we managed to increase to around 2,000 hectares.
But where are the remaining 9,000? How did you acquire those?
These properties have been bought as from the year 2000 because we have donors as Saving Nature who help us acquire properties inside the Guapiaçu watershed. So that's one of REGUA's program, the expansion program, to protect as much forest as we can. So we started with 900 hectares, then almost 2,000 hectares, and every year we have donors giving us the money to buy more and more properties, now reaching 8,000 hectares, REGUA's land, and 11,000 with farmers, as we consider, because it's all at the same forest mountain range.
Can you explain to me and to the listeners how big is an area that's 11,000 hectares? I was trying to calculate it. I'm not very good at maths, I must confess. It's hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, so we usually compare to a football stage. So 1 hectare would be as an equivalent to a football stage. And those would be 11,000 football stages. I'm not sure if this is the measurement we use here in Brazil and also with our donors. Some people talk about acres, but I'm not sure if you use acres.
I think the football stadiums are a good comparison, yeah. And what is your goal? How many hectares do you still want to buy?
We want to double the size of REGUA, all inside the Guapiaçu watershed. So we are always talking about the Guapiaçu watershed because it's a very important area which supplies water for the Rio de Janeiro city. So all of the REGUA mountains, there are several rivers that start here, and then they follow, forming the Macacu main river, and that will feed a big reservoir supplying water for 2 million people in the city of Rio. So that's why also we are kind of in a strategic place and having all the support from local government, which they know the importance of this area.
Yeah, it's important to have the support of the politicians.
Yes, exactly.
And is it easy to buy land? Are people willing to sell it?
Yes, they are. Here in our place, it's very rural. So usually people would use lowland areas to grow crops. And when they have hills, it's not very useful for them because it's usually covered by forest and they cannot cut down the forest. So it's not useful for people any longer. And before, people used to have cattle, but that has become very expensive in Brazil. So the main use here in the rural areas are to grow crops. So we usually don't compete who is willing to still grow crops. Usually people who sell their properties are looking at forested areas or hills which have erosion problems or that have been occupied by cattle for a long time and do not produce any longer, or even places that sometimes people here in the rural areas set fire to big areas. You must have seen it. It also happens in the Pantanal or in the Amazon.
Yeah, the slash and burn technique, right?
Yes, exactly. And they don't want the forest to come up, so they just set fire. And that's even dangerous for people who have planted trees, and then we have to go back to make sure that the grass is controlled and is not competing with the saplings. So we don't have many difficulties in finding areas so people come to the reserve and they say, oh, I have this area, it's a 40 hectare area, it's not productive any longer. I don't want it to be divided into small plots. I don't want my heirs to turn into a condominium. So I want REGUA to plant this area. So if you make sure that this will happen, I'm happy to sell it for you. So we are very lucky and we are happy with that this is happening.
Yeah, you're lucky. You touched on reforestation, and that's another area that I wanted to discuss. You've been reforesting areas where trees had been cleared for timber and agriculture. How many trees have you planted so far?
Well, we have reached 800,000 trees planted.
Wow.
So it's a lot.
Are all these trees still growing?
Yes, they are. They are growing because you will have, I could say that a mature forest where you have all the epiphytes coming back to the forest again, all the orchids, the bromeliads, they would come back to the forest when they reach 40 years old. So our oldest restoration site is around 16 years old. So you can see that the trees are still growing. They're not very thick. So you can see there are some gaps. And I usually make a joke and telling our visitors or our volunteers saying that when you know it's a growing forest, you can understand that it's a very messy forest because the first colonizers, the trees which grow faster, when they reach 10 years old, they start breaking. All the branches and the leaves, because they are making space for the secondary growth trees. They follow a growth groups. They have different growing periods. So we use the pioneer species, which will grow fast and create shadow for the others, which demand a little bit more, especially because they won't take the sun on top of them, so they need the shade from the other trees. And then the most important trees, the ones with the hardwood trees, are the ones which grow even slower. They take maybe 50 or 100 years to become very tall and to produce lots of seeds. So the pioneers, when they reach 10 years old, they will start dying, making the way to the secondary growth and the third growth trees. So they follow more or less a time.
It's a life cycle.
It is a life cycle.
So what type of trees do you plant?
We usually collect seeds in the forest, here at the reserve, or if we don't have the species we know is producing fruit, we will go to the neighboring areas. So REGUA is very concerned about diversity and also the quality of its seeds. So we want to make sure we'll have very good trees and that they will survive in the planting areas. So we have around 500 mother trees. We know where they are. And our nursery head, Mauricio, knows when they're flowering, knows when they give seeds. So he plans his outings to make sure he'll grab as much seeds as he can. So, but we don't use 500 species as at the same time. We usually, sometimes we're noticing for climate change that some trees are taking longer to flower. So maybe this year we won't use the same species as the year before because they didn't flower at the same period. It's all very complex, but we kind of use around 250 species. So he knows which are the ones that produce the most seeds that year can offer. Let's put it like that.
It's great that you care about the diversity of these trees and the fact that they're local, because you get to hear about a lot of reforestation efforts where people are boasting how many trees they planted, but then when you ask, they're just planting eucalyptus, for example. So
Yeah.
that doesn't help.
No, that doesn't help. And we teach the kids so we take them to the nursery and then we tell them, "Oh, kids, you're seeing so much variety. So, but why is it important?" And then we ask them, "Do you think with this species we are going to feed only one bird? Has the Atlantic forest only one bird, or do you think REGUA has only one bird species?" No, REGUA has 485 bird species. And they all eat different things. So we need different species to feed all the animals. And that's why we make some jokes and they can understand the importance of diversity. Because we also have kids coming to visit us. So at the nursery, we managed to produce around 100,000 trees or saplings per year. So sometimes that's not enough to attend our restoration sites, but we buy from local nurseries, which also work with native Atlantic forest species.
Where do you choose the places where you plant the trees, and how do you or saplings, and how do you take care of them so they grow into maturity?
Usually they will take up to 1 year, the whole process of collecting the seed in the forest, bringing it to the nursery, allowing to grow, and then put it in the plastic container. And then you have to wait a little bit more for it to become stronger. And then the last phase of this process is to leave it 2 or 3 months, taking rain and sun as much as it can to become strong enough to be taken to the restoration site. So it would take around 1 year to have a sapling ready to go to the field. And then once it's planted, we have a truck which takes around 2,000 saplings per day to this restoration site. So we plant them, and every 3 months, the team needs to go back to make sure the grass is controlled. We have to cut down all the grass, because the grass can grow more than the sapling, and that will impact on its growth. Grass and ants are really problematic. They can interfere on the tree sapling development.
And so after these 3 months or maybe 1 year of checking it every 3 months, is the tree independent and it can grow?
Yes, it can grow. It might reach 1 or 2 meters. So you can be a little bit more chilled about it. But maybe the team will need to go back after 6 months to make sure that the grass is still controlled, because it's very insisting. The grass, usually the areas we plant used to be used for cattle. So maybe a very strong grass was planted there, and it's well known for us. It's called brachiaria. It has very, very strong roots. So you have to make sure it's all removed when you start planting the trees. But then, of course, they grow again. And then again. So it will only have removed all the grass when the area is completely shaded. When the trees will have grown, the pioneers especially will have reached a point where they have created shade and no more grass will grow, because they need the sun to grow. And that would be around 3-4 years.
It's a lot of work.
And then you can have ants also eating the leaves and interfering.
Here the main danger is deer that tends to, bite the tree.
Yeah, I imagine. Here it's the ants. When we began the tapir reintroduction program, we were worried that the tapirs will feed on the growing trees. But they don't seem to mind it. They have plenty of food in the forest. So that's not a problem for us.
How do you choose the places where you plant the forest? Are you thinking about it in a strategic way that you want to connect these fragmented areas by these reforested places?
Sure. So we would usually choose hills, and then we would carefully study which areas can connect to each other and connect to the REGUA forest, or maybe areas which are closer to areas that will have a forest fragment.
Okay, that was complicated. The second scenario.
So imagine if somebody offers us an area of property which is far away from REGUA, and consequently it's far away from this patch of forest. But maybe it is a bit closer to the forest in Cachoeira de Macacu from the city. So we'll choose this area because it's closer to a forest fragment, even if it's not close to REGUA, but at least it's closer to a forest fragment. And eventually, who knows, in the future, we'll start buying areas close to this area, and then we will eventually connect. So we have created a corridor. There's a road that prevents them from touching each other, but at least we managed to secure lowland, top of the hill, going back the other side of the hill, and then another third property that is also a hill. So we managed to create a little strap that it has become a corridor.
Who uses that corridor?
All the animals, on the cats especially, the pumas, the ocelots, margays, and wild cats. The tapirs walk a lot. They need a big area to survive. They can walk up to 11 kilometers per day in search of food or just exploring the territory. So, and they are also expanding their living area. So when the first animals arrived here at the reserve, we built a release pen because they need to adapt to the new ecosystem, to the new climate. So they need to be 2 months adapting to this new territory. And the first couple who was released at the wetlands, they adapted really well. And then the second couple arrived, and of course we didn't know that they were so territorialist. So they immediately fought the males, and we have unfortunately lost maybe 5 tapirs because of these fights. So that goes very well with the expansion of REGUA, because the tapirs need constantly, because the population is becoming bigger, they need to expand their areas. So the areas REGUA is buying is very important to go along with this expansion of the population of tapirs.
It's complicated science, conservation. You never know how things will turn out, right? You might think that it's good to have a lot of individuals of one species together, but then you're surprised that there are fights and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And then now the research, we have lots of researchers studying here at the reserve. Some of them are monitoring, for instance, the bigger mammals here, monitoring the pumas. And one of the researchers is very concerned because this year we have 10 cubs. We have 10 offsprings. So he's saying, I don't know what to think. I have never seen so many baby pumas. And now we're going to create signs because we are afraid that we'll start seeing pumas walking in front of people's houses. And well, that's a consequence of protecting the area, but it's already an area that belongs to these species. So we have to give a chance to nature again. It's just because we have 10 cows, we have to allow nature to survive. So we'll see what will happen. But pumas are also fight for territory. So maybe an older one will die, and then that will give the chance for a younger one to become the owner of that territory. So let's see what's going to happen.
Let's see, maybe you will have to create a new section of your organization, Human-Wildlife Conflict.
Oh my gosh, yes. No, hopefully not. People are very concerned about the pumas, but the pumas, they're not as big as jaguars, and they do not attack people. They're very shy animals. We only see them in camera traps.
Okay, all right. In 2019, you teamed up with Saving Nature. What do you work on together?
Saving Nature has helped us a lot to acquire strategic, like you were saying, areas that will form the important connecting Atlantic forest corridors.
Mm-hmm. I know about the Golden Tamarine corridor. Then they also helped create another corridor where they built a bridge over a highway and forested it so animals could cross. And now this is the third corridor that they're helping to finance and create. So yeah, it's so important to connect these fragmented areas so that animals can migrate and find food and find mates.
Yeah, so that's why you keep a forest alive, because there's a syndrome, it's called as the empty forest syndrome. Here we call it like this in Brazil, where you have a forest, but you don't have animals. So you're not allowing the services, the forest services to happen, because the animals, they eat other animals, they will disperse seeds, so they are spreading and making the forest become alive. So that's what happens in the Tijuca forest in the heart of Rio de Janeiro city. It's a very big patch of forest, but there are no animals inside because it's all surrounded by the city. So you don't have a forest alive because you don't have animals. They have all been hunted. It's very sad, and that happens. And here we know that in REGUA we have restoration areas that they're still forming all these little alliances, and we have the more mature forests where you can see the difference with the species, with the bird species, with the bigger mammals, and you see that there's life there. We didn't used to see a bird called the solitary tinamou, and it was very much hunted 50 years ago, 40 years ago, because we had lots of hunting problems before the reserve was created. And now we go to the forest and we started to see them in camera traps. But now when we walk there, we see the whole family, the mother with the little chick. And they're great food also for the pumas. So they're very cute, but they play a very important role too. So it's very nice to see this species that weren't seen for a long time. And now we don't have many problems with hunting anymore because we have rangers working at the reserve, and that prevents hunters from going to the forest.
Yeah, it's great to hear all that you're saying. You didn't end up as an empty nest forest, or as some people say, a silent forest. I think it comes from Indonesia, where forests are just silent because there are no birds singing. But your forest is an example that when people try really hard, they can restore nature, because it could have ended up really badly. But because people like you were dedicated and hardworking, it's a prosperous forest. And although we didn't touch on this in this interview, I read that you're also helping the local communities.
Yes.
And you're a big employer in the area. So that's just great.
Yeah, it is. Sometimes I keep on thinking that, like you said, it could have been totally different. This area could have been sold to a big company, or big soft drinks company. We have the beer company, it could have been soft drinks, or maybe a huge condominium for very rich people from Rio. But instead of that, it's a nature reserve and trying to protect the remaining forest, creating job opportunities for young people, or for people who choose to live in this area, not leaving the area to go to the cities. We work with the kids here in our neighboring communities, and they come weekly, and they are called the Young Rangers. So we have an environmental officer who teaches them basic concepts of nature, and they're all doing arts and crafts, and every volunteer or every visitor who is more willing to talk to them, we present them, and you see that they're so enchanted with this. The people from outside, they think, oh, why are these people coming to this area? And then they talk about their cities, or why they chose to come to REGUA. And they become so happy. And it's so nice because some of these kids cannot go out much. They just go to school and then go back to their houses. And it's a way to open their minds. So it's lovely to see their commitment to come every week, and their willingness to learn more about everything at the end of the day. So we are happy with that. We're always trying to do more at the reserve. So we're always busy trying to create some events, cycling events and walking events, and it's non-stop, but it's very, very, very nice to be part of the REGUA team.
Well, you're bringing up a new generation of conservationists. That's great.
Yes, thank you. Yes, hopefully.
So thanks so much for your work, for everyone in REGUA who is working on this. Even though I've never visited your forest, I'm already having a feeling that it must be a great place. And I'm so happy that people like you exist and protect nature. So thanks so much for the interview.
Thank you. You're welcome to come anytime to walk and explore.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to this conversation. I hope that it left you with a feeling that no matter how challenging the environment where we live can be, it's worth trying to change it for the better. We can all be solutionaries. If you enjoyed this episode, why not listen to the next one? The easiest way is to subscribe to my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or get a monthly newsletter by subscribing to it on my website, veronicaperkova.com. If you have one spare minute, please consider sharing this podcast with your closest friends. I really appreciate your help. I'm Veronica Perkova, and I look forward to talking to you soon.